Just for people to know, I'm only being recorded. It'll show my screen. Nobody else will be recorded. You'll not have your faces on it. So you won't have to worry about confidentiality. So in terms of the background, I'm pretty sure Andrew's on this call, and I keep doing this to him in calls I'm in with him. But some of you might have heard about the Net Zero Teesside case. This is a case that is based in the north of England, where a lot of major industrial polluters have been vying for varying pots of government funding to set up carbon capture and other sort of processes in the area. For those that don't know, carbon capture is a process that's meant to, and I really stress that, meant to capture industrial emissions from a point source, so something like an oil and gas power station, for example. And it's meant to capture the carbon generated from the burning in that power station and then send that carbon theoretically to a sort of a geological location. Sometimes it's not, but in Scotland, that carbon would be stored in the North Sea in geological formations. So carbon capture has been proposed all over the UK, but in this particular instance, there was an environmental impact assessment done by the developers of this carbon capture project there in the Net Zero Teesside case. And yeah, Dr. Andrew Boswell looked at the environmental impact assessment and was like, I think some of the numbers here aren't quite right. It's a bit of a longer saga, and I will put the link in the chat, or maybe Andrew can, about this project, because there's some discrepancies in the numbers over a period of time, not just one time. But in short, he'd found that the developers had put the environmental impact assessment numbers wrong, and went on to take the Net Zero Teesside project to court, and is currently in a reappeal stage around this. So it's very, very good. He's sort of realized that this project will be responsible for 20 million tons of carbon pollution. I believe it's between 20 and 40 million tons of CO2, which is much higher than the 6 million tons that were reported by the developers. And this got us thinking, wait, there's an overlap with the developers of this project and the Peterhead project. Let's look into the environmental impact assessment of the Peterhead power station project. So Carbon Tracker, who are a climate-based think tank, analysed the developers' environmental impact assessment. So it was SSE who submitted this impact assessment. The impact assessment, many of you will know, is an official document that has to be submitted to the Scottish Government, and contains lots and lots and lots of things. But one thing the environmental impact assessment contains is things like atmospheric pollution, also pollution in terms of what it might impact on a water course, for example. So Carbon Tracker looked at the impact assessment to see whether the developers had accurately reported the future climate impact of the Peterhead power station. I'm going to give you one guess on if it was reported accurately. So no, it turns out that the developers hadn't reported on the impact assessment in its entirety, and had missed out on a lot of key things. There had been 3 key emissions from the environmental impact assessment. So the first one was that they had not included emissions from outages and maintenance. Obviously, SSE are an energy provider, and they should very well know that there should be maintenance and outages taking part in a power station of any kind. They had it down that the power station be working 100% of the time. The second thing that was missing from that environmental impact assessment was the extraction and transportation emissions were unaccounted for. So some of you might know those are called upstream emissions. So the developers had just completely failed to account for that area. And they had also said in their environmental impact assessment that they would be accounting for something called the raw material extraction emissions. So they had written themselves, we're going to take into account how much climate emissions would be generated from this, and then have failed to include that. And upstream emissions are actually one of the largest sources of CO2 attached to a project. So it's very, very crucial that it's quite a big finding that that's not there. And the third omission is that they could be overestimating the carbon capture rate. Now, SSE have it down that they would capture 90% of carbon emissions from the site. However, many of you will know that carbon capture is often very much overpromised and underdelivered. It has a long, long history of failure. It's been around since the 1970s. And, you know, in 50 years, there hasn't been any performance increase. It's just kind of a background of failure with many projects across the globe failing to reach those performance rates. Again, after I finish talking, I'll put some links into the chat for people who might be interested in having a bit of a dig around at some failed projects around the world. It's also very important to say that there are no power stations doing what Peterhead, the Peterhead project would do anywhere in the world. So what went on was, oh, I tried to put a little thing here that's missed, but that's fine. So what happened was that Carbon Tracker modeled 5 scenarios to evaluate the impact of the key emissions in the Peterhead CCS EIA report. So having looked at all of the things that were missing, the researchers were like, okay, let's actually put these things in that weren't there, and we'll see what the impact would be if those things were missing. So this is one graph that kind of explains those things. So here you'll see that this is the developer's EIA report. This is what they had down. They just had down, you know, a full 90% capture rate. They hadn't included anything from the transportation or extraction of gas, and they have it working 100% of the time. Here you can see that we have now modeled the different things that are missing all the way up to here. So we looked at the sort of current supply of gas. We looked at the future supply of gas in the UK. And then this one here, it says 100% LNG. So LNG for those who don't know, means liquid natural gas. And that's a sort of a modeling of what would happen if the project was to run on 100% gas from somewhere else, so say the US or Qatar. There's very real admission from the UK and Scottish governments that we will, you know, not be relying on North Sea gas. In the future, it's a mature basin, so there's a very real chance that we will be relying on gas that could be imported from places like the States, the Qatar. The States, around 80%, I think, of that gas is fracked gas. So it's very important to consider that, you know, Scotland has a rich history of campaigning around fracking, and the Peterhead Power Station could very much be relying on fracked gas, you know, not from here, but certainly from somewhere else. And we also modeled a scenario that looked at what would happen if Peterhead only captured, say, something like 75% of the carbon instead of 90% of the carbon that SSE had promised. We also did 2 more pessimistic scenarios, which were here, and those were sort of rates that were even lower than the 90% capture of CCS. And you can see that this part here is the sort of total lifetime emissions. So SSE have reported that their total lifetime emissions would be 6.3 million tons of CO2. However, it could be much, 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 much higher if you factor in all of the things that they have, frankly, not put in. So to very much easily sum that up, the research found that the lifetime emissions of Peterhead could be 3 to 5 times higher than reported by the developer. And I really want to stress that the modeling that was done was actually quite conservative. So you might notice that we modeled something like 70 to 75% captured, you know, to take in to account a more conservative capture scenario. But there are projects around the world that have only captured 40%. The reason that we decided to pick 70% capture rate is that there is a thing called the dispatchable power agreement, a very techie term, but it means that power stations around the UK will be able to claim payments basically for their power stations from governments if they capture 70%. So even if you say, oh, we're going to capture 90% and then you only capture 70, you can still be in receipt of payments, which is quite wild. So we chose to stick to that 70%. The developers have emitted emissions from the extraction, processing, and transportation of gas. Like I said, the upstream emissions from their calculations. This is a huge source of CO2 that's just not been accounted for or factored in. Another really key thing that the research highlights is the plant is set to continue until 2059, which is 14 years after Scotland is due to reach net zero. And emissions from the plant could account for the equivalent of 50 to 80% of Scotland's annual emissions in 2044, which is absolutely massive. What it means is that other sectors need to go much further and much faster to decarbonize if this one power station was to go ahead. It puts huge pressures on all sectors of the economy. So obviously transportation, agriculture, they're really hard to decarbonize sectors in Scotland. And it means that these sectors now need to cut their emissions hugely to make up for this. So it's damaging across all other sectors, not just power generation. In terms of the CCS, the research found that the unavailability of carbon capture, so if the CCS wasn't working or was down in times of maintenance, would increase annual emissions by 40% compared to the baseline, and carbon emissions increase tenfold for every hour the carbon capture is not working, which is absolutely massive. There are 2 pilot projects that are trialing carbon capture on gas power plants, and those exist at a scale 20 times smaller than the proposed Peterhead CCS plant. So they're teeny tiny little things. They don't work at the scale that's being promised, and really kind of demonstrates that there isn't any sort of case for this. There isn't any examples to build on. I've put this in here as well, and this is a really great finding by Carbon Tracker. Peterhead does not provide us with homegrown energy or energy security. Sometimes you hear proponents of oil and gas, proponents of CCS, some politicians will say, well, no, we need to be having our homegrown energy, we need to be relying on North Sea. Now, if gas demand from all the planned CCS and fossil hydrogen or blue hydrogen projects across the UK went ahead, that could be more than twice the projected North Sea production. So even if that was to happen, it just wouldn't be there. The gas wouldn't be there to be filtering in to these sort of CCS projects. So they would have to rely on imported gas. And what this really, really means is that the Scottish Government is making its decision on whether to approve the power station without the full information of the project's damaging climate impacts. They're sitting there with the decision right in front of them without the full information. And we really need, at this point, the Scottish Government to order SSE and Equinor, the joint developers, back to the drawing board to redo their environmental impact assessment. We believe, when the Scottish Government see the real climate impact, the only rational response would be to reject it and focus on rapidly building up Scotland's renewable energy future. I've included these fantastic images of people who have been campaigning over the past year to put pressure on the Scottish Government. It's been incredible. A lot of people have been organising this themselves and are part of very much of a fossil-free movement across Scotland. We situate ourselves in a wider fossil-free movement where there are lots of projects that we're all fighting together. Some of those will include Rosebank, which you'll see there, and lots of groups are working together across this movement, which has been really, really lovely to see. The sort of top one here is people outside of the SSE's AGM, have the North Sea Knitters. I can't see if any of you are here today, but accosting John Swinney very wonderfully to ask him about Peterhead and other fossil-free projects and his commitment to climate. And more recently, there have been people outside of the Scottish Parliament pushing the Scottish Government to redo or to order SSE and Equinor to redo their environmental impact assessment. And the pressure is working. I thought I'd include this here because sometimes when you're campaigning, it's such a slog and it's really hard sometimes to measure, isn't it? But this top little clip here, you'll notice very sneakily, it says promoted content. by SSE, and it was an article that was in the Times a couple of months ago. And the article very much is saying, oh, carbon capture is brilliant, we really, really need it. And I have definitely seen an uptick in SSE putting out a lot of pro carbon capture stuff. Now, that can be difficult to fight back against, but it's clear that they're feeling that pressure and they know that they're not able to sneak this through anymore, which is really, really important. This is also an image of SSE's planning schedule. And you can see that the start of construction of the power station was meant to be 2023, 2024. And we're about to end this year, and there has been no construction. So it's very much been delayed. And there's really no doubt in my mind that a lot of that has been down to really fantastic campaigning and advocacy on the part of many, many people. And I'm going to stop there